This video was intended to inform and educate the public.
What you gonna do when they come for you?
Welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this video from the Junkyard News. In today's topic, I want to talk about a current story that just broke in Carlsbad, California, where a suspect was fired upon as he fled the area after an unprovoked attack on a police officer in Carlsbad, California. Let's discuss what happened.
Officer is recovering tonight after he was hit in the head with a skateboard during an unprovoked attack.
Now, in a news release by the City of San Diego Police Department, an outside agency from the Carlsbad Police Department who investigated this incident and the officer-involved shooting, claims that in Carlsbad, on Friday, a Carlsbad police officer was driving down Carlsbad Village Drive when he passed underneath Interstate 5, and that is when a rock struck the vehicle, destroyed the spotlight of the vehicle, and damaged the windshield. Now, when this happened, the officer called for a supervisor because the windshield was damaged and he lost the spotlight, and he pulled over into a nearby parking lot to inspect the damage to the vehicle. As the officer and the supervisor were inspecting the damage of the patrol car, a suspect ran up behind the officer and, without warning or provocation, assaulted the officer by striking him in the head with a skateboard. And the officer who was struck in the head took out his service weapon and, as he sought cover from a nearby business, discharged his firearm 3 times at the suspect as he ran west through the parking lot. At the same time, the sergeant chased the suspect on foot west on Carlsbad Village Drive. Additional officers arrived in the area, and after approximately 3 blocks, the suspect was taken into custody without incident. Now, the officer was not engaged in any enforcement activities when his car was struck by this rock or when the suspect assaulted the officer. He was merely with his supervisor inspecting damage. Now, the suspect was not struck by the gunfire, and there were no reports of injuries to any citizens. The officer was transported to the local hospital with serious head injuries and remains there for treatment. Detectives from the San Diego Police Department Homicide Unit are currently investigating this incident. The skateboard that was used in the attack of the Carlsbad officer was recovered at the scene, and detectives are currently investigating whether the rock that initially struck the patrol car in this incident was an accident or an intentional act carried out by the suspect, or maybe even an accomplice. The Carlsbad police officer who fired his weapon has been employed by Carlsbad Police Department since September of 2022. He is currently assigned as a patrol officer, but he does have a total of 8 years of law enforcement experience. Now, the suspect in this case has been identified as Kyle McCord of San Diego. He is described as a 32-year-old white male. McCord was booked into Vista Jail for attempted murder of a police officer and committing a felony while on bond or release. This guy, Kyle McCord, was on bond or release from a previous incident. So one might think that he had a grudge or he didn't like the fact that he was arrested or charged in a previous incident and was potentially looking for a little payback. So the discussion that I want to have is the discussion of this officer firing his weapon at a fleeing suspect who was nowhere near him. Let's discuss that. But first, here's a news clip about the incident.
After he was hit in the head with a skateboard during an unprovoked attack. It happened last night around 11. Investigators say the officer was driving on Carlsbad Village Drive under I-5 when a rock hit his patrol car's windshield and spotlight. The officer then pulled into a parking lot nearby. When he was checking out the damage, a guy ran up from behind and hit the officer in the head with the skateboard. The officer then fired his gun 3 times as the attacker ran off. He was not hit, but was arrested nearby. That suspect, identified as 32-year-old Kyle McCord, is facing charges of attempted murder and committing a felony while on bond or release. The injured officer was taken to the hospital for treatment.
Now, some may ask, can a police officer really shoot at a fleeing suspect who poses at that moment no danger? And the legality of a police officer shooting at a fleeing suspect who poses no danger varies depending on the specific circumstances and the laws of that jurisdiction. In many jurisdictions, law enforcement officers are only authorized to use lethal force when they believe there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm to themselves or others. And shooting at a fleeing suspect who does not pose a threat may be considered excessive use of force and could lead to legal consequences for the officer involved. But however, there are exceptions to this general rule, especially when dealing with law enforcement. For example, some jurisdictions do have laws that allow officers to use lethal force to prevent the escape of a fleeing felon who is considered dangerous or who has committed a violent crime. And that may be the crux of this incident right here. Additionally, the specific circumstances of the situation, such as the severity of the crime committed by the suspect, the level of danger they may pose to the public, and the officer's perception of the situation may also be taken into account when determining whether the use of lethal force was justified at that moment. Overall, the use of lethal force by law enforcement officers can be a very complex and highly regulated issue, as we all know. And it is essential for officers to receive proper training on the appropriate use of force and to adhere to relevant laws and departmental policies. Additionally, cases involving the use of lethal force by a police officer are often subject to thorough investigations to determine whether the use of force was justified under the circumstances. You know the quote I love, "We investigated ourselves and found no wrongdoing." Some of you out there may be asking yourself, but can't the officer be charged with a crime for doing that? Down the line, of course. If a police officer shoots at a fleeing suspect who in that moment poses no danger, and it is determined that the use of force was unjustified or excessive, the officer could potentially be charged with a crime. This would depend on various factors, of course, including the laws of that jurisdiction, the specific circumstances of the incident, and whether the officer's actions are deemed to have violated those laws. Again, in many jurisdictions, law enforcement officers are subject to the same laws as civilians when it comes to the use of force, but it never seems to be balanced. If it is determined that the officer's actions amounted to unlawful conduct such as assault or homicide, the officer could face criminal charges just like any other individual, but as we all know, that rarely happens. And when it does happen, it's usually a much lighter sentence than anybody else would get for the same crime when they're supposed to be held to a higher standard, not a lower standard. Furthermore, even if criminal charges are not filed, the officer could still face disciplinary action within their own police department, including termination or suspension, if their actions are found to have violated departmental policies or procedures. But again, when cops investigate themselves, they normally find no wrongdoing. And personally, I can't see in this type of situation where a department would have any issue with an officer who's concussed, dazed, confused, pulling out his gun and just shooting wildly with no regard for any civilians out there or people in the backdrop or cars going by. Just dazed, confused, and shooting wildly. Of course, he was in his right state of mind, so we can't blame him. He was just hit in the head with a skateboard. What did you expect him to do? So comment below what you think. If somebody walks up behind an officer, smacks him in the head with a skateboard, which could be a lethal weapon, thus his charge is attempted murder, do you think the officer was justified when the threat was gone and over and the suspect was fleeing in drawing his firearm and proceeding to shoot downrange at the fleeing suspect who at that moment didn't pose any danger to anybody, and in fact possibly created more of a dangerous situation by sending lead downrange? I think we're lucky that none of those rounds found its way to an innocent person on the street or even in a business. Personally, I find it lucky that none of those rounds found a mark on an innocent person. Again, comment below what you think. Do you think this officer was justified in shooting at this fleeing suspect who posed at that moment no real danger to anybody and was just fleeing the scene and trying to get away? Or do you think that this officer is going to be given a pass based on the totality of the circumstances and will recover and be back on the streets in no time with maybe a bump in pay? Let me know in the comments. And thank you again for watching The Junkyard News. We'll see you in the next video.